The scent of beeswax candles and aged parchment hung heavy in the air of the Schönbrunn Palace music room. Vienna, 1785. A city of waltzes, powdered wigs, and ruthless ambition, where an artist's name was their currency. Elias von Edelweiss stood center stage, his chest swelling with manufactured pride, basking in the thunderous applause. He executed a practiced low bow, acknowledging the emperor's nod and the scattered bravos from the glittering aristocracy. The performance had been flawless, a dizzying, complex symphony in D minor, surging with a passion that felt almost dangerous in the polite, gilded room. Elias, however, was not the source of that passion. He was merely the conductor of his own deception. The truth, a sharp, dissonant chord, was hiding just 20 feet away. Behind a heavy velvet curtain, tucked into a cramped, dusty alcove that served as a makeshift storage closet, sat Ilara von Edelweiss. She was curled around a single sputtering candle, a quill stain marring the cuff of her simple gown, and the music, her music, still ringing in her ears. Elias's applause was hers. His triumph was her secret, a bitter, fragile glass she held tight against her heart. She was the mind, she was the soul, and she was utterly invisible. Elias had been, by all accounts, a mediocre musician, pleasant enough at the harpsichord, competent with a violin, but lacking that electric spark, that divine, chaotic genius that separated a craftsman from a master. Ilara had that spark. From the moment she could reach the keys of the family's old spinet, music had poured out of her, an unstoppable river of sound. While Elias struggled to memorize standard minuets, Ilara was already dreaming of symphonies, of towering brass, mournful cellos, and woodwinds that spoke the secrets of the night. But Ilara was a woman, and in the rigid, powdered world of 18th century Vienna, a woman could not be a composer of serious music. She could be a salon singer, a music teacher to young ladies, or a patron's pretty diversion. She could not claim the conductor's podium. The deception had started 5 years ago, born of desperation. Their family, a minor noble house, was sinking under old debts. Elias, the eldest son, was expected to restore their name. "You write the notes, Ilara," Elias had pleaded that night, his voice thick with shame. "I will take the bow. They will pay me handsomely, and the family will survive. It is the only way." And so E. von Edelweiss was born, a prodigy of Vienna's elite, celebrated for his masculine strength and bold harmonies. Ilara, his delicate, quiet sister, was merely his personal copyist, confined to her room, her genius wrapped in silence. The aftermath. The curtain rustled, and a sliver of candlelight fell across Ilara's face. Elias had found her. He held a glass of sweet Tokaji wine in one hand and a thick velvet purse, heavy with the emperor's gold, in the other. His usually anxious eyes were shining, intoxicated by the evening's acclaim. "We did it, my sister," he whispered, his voice hoarse with adrenaline. He didn't say "I did it," he said "we." It was the only shred of honesty he still allowed himself. Ilara smoothed the score that lay on her lap, the working draft of the D minor symphony, scrawled with her rapid, impassioned hand. "The tempo of the third movement. You took it slightly too slow in the reprise. The allegro is meant to be a chase, not a canter." His smile faltered. "No one noticed, Ilara, not a soul. The emperor called it sublime." He paused, then softened his voice. "Come, stand up. I must be seen leaving the palace, and you must accompany me. You look pale. Are you well?" "I am well," Ilara said, the lie tasting flat and dry. She was never well. She was a constant pulsing headache of suppressed creativity. As they walked through the palace hallways, the weight of the secret felt unbearable. The gold in Elias's purse was a tether, binding her to the lie. Suddenly, a voice boomed from behind them. "Herr von Edelweiss, hold a moment." It was Count Victor Malice, the famous and famously ruthless music critic and patron of the arts, a man whose word could launch a career into the stratosphere or plummet it into the gutter. He was accompanied by Herr Anton Kreutzer, the Kapellmeister of the Vienna Court Opera, a position Elias desperately coveted. Count Malice stopped before them, his eyes sharp and assessing, first lingering on Elias, then flicking dismissively to Ilara. "Herr von Edelweiss," the Count purred, holding up a finger. "Tonight's symphony, it lacks the polish of your earlier works, yes? But it possesses a certain raw, untamed fire. You have great ambition, young man." Elias bowed. "You are too generous, Count." "Perhaps," the Count said, leaning in conspiratorially, "but it has captured the attention of Herr Kreutzer. He is looking for a new work to debut at the Court Opera's Winter Gala, a concerto for violin and orchestra, a piece of profound complexity and virtuosity. The challenge is immense. The reward is immortality." Elias's breath caught. The court opera, the very heart of the musical world. "I would be honored," Elias stammered, gripping Ilara's arm tightly. "Good," the Count said, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "The deadline is strict, 6 weeks, and Herr Kreutzer is highly demanding. We will require several private meetings to discuss the technical demands. Bring your copyist with you, Herr Edelweiss. I detest sloppiness." Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. A concerto, 6 weeks, and now the true master would be forced into the same room as the harshest critics, forever pretending to be nothing more than a quiet, useful shadow. The air crackled with danger and opportunity. For Elias, it was the chance of a lifetime. For Ilara, it was a 6-week sentence to the hottest, most terrifying corner of her gilded cage.
Ilara's room, usually her sanctuary, had become her prison cell. Sunlight rarely reached the small north-facing window, making the room perpetually dim, perfect for hiding secrets, but terrible for the soul. The next morning, the grand challenge, the violin concerto in G major, lay spread across her composing desk, a blank battlefield of ruled parchment. 6 weeks to produce a work of profound complexity and virtuosity. A symphony allowed for grand, sweeping gestures where flaws could be masked in the sheer scale of the orchestra. A concerto, however, was intimate, demanding a conversation between the soloist and the ensemble. The violin part had to be impossibly brilliant, showcasing technique that Kreutzer himself would admire. And Ilara had to compose it all in secret while attending meetings where Elias was expected to discuss the intricacies of his own creation. Ilara dipped her quill into the ink, but the inspiration was blocked by a wall of anxiety. She wasn't composing for the music anymore, she was composing to maintain a lie. Could she do it? The melody was there, humming beneath the surface, but the structure, the careful, rigorous geometry of a 3-movement concerto, felt overwhelming. 1. Allegro con fuego. 2. Adagio semplice. 3. Rondo prestissimo. She drew a single clean treble clef, then pushed the parchment away, massaging the tension from her temples. She needed to know the enemy. The interview. The first meeting with Kapellmeister Kreutzer and Count Malos was held 3 days later in the austere private dining room of a powerful Viennese patron. Elias looked polished, confident in his borrowed finery. Ilara, dressed in a simple gray wool gown, stood silently by a tall cupboard, a sheaf of blank parchment clutched like a shield. Kreutzer was a man built like a bulldog, all stern angles and impatient intensity. Malos was all deceptive smoothness, watching everything with the casual air of a predator observing prey. Kreutzer did not waste time with pleasantries. He immediately began questioning Elias about his compositional process, his technique, and his vision for the concerto. "Tell me, Herr Edelweiss," Kreutzer demanded, without looking up from his coffee. "What is your feeling on the double-stop passage in the first movement? I want fire, not mere fireworks. Do you favor the chromatic ascent or a more diatonic tension build?" Elias froze. He knew the terms, every musician did, but he couldn't articulate the compositional reasoning behind a choice he hadn't made. He nervously glanced at Alara. Alara knew the answer instantly. The chromatic ascent was too obvious, too common. The piece needed a surprise. "Well, Herr Kreutzer," Elias began, his voice wavering, I favor a unique approach." Before Elias could sink completely, Alara, without moving or speaking, cleared her throat gently, a tiny, almost inaudible sound. Then she subtly brushed her fingertips against her left elbow twice. Chromatic ascent. It was a code they had developed years ago. One touch for the standard, expected answer. Two for the bold, innovative, and riskier choice. Elias caught the movement in his peripheral vision, his mind racing. Alara wanted the bold answer. "I am planning a diatonic tension build with an unexpected, sudden harmonic pivot into the dominant minor in the final measure. The audience should feel the floor drop out just as the soloist resolves the tension." Kreutzer looked up sharply, a flicker of surprise in his steel-gray eyes. "Interesting," Kreutzer muttered, making a note. "Highly effective if executed properly, but technically challenging for the soloist. You must ensure the rest of the orchestra supports that pivot perfectly, or the effect will be mud." "Naturally," Elias replied, letting out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Alara felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She had just committed herself to an incredibly complicated passage, a passage she now had to write perfectly, all to cover for a 3-second hesitation. The stakes were too high for their little parlor tricks. The glare of Malus. Count Malos, who had remained silent, now spoke, his voice dangerously smooth. "Your sister is quiet, Herr Edelweiss, a very attentive copyist. You are fortunate to have such a diligent helper." Alara felt the weight of his stare, an unnerving focus that made her skin crawl. "She is invaluable," Elias said quickly, stepping slightly in front of her. Malos leaned back, an unreadable smile on his lips. "She must have excellent pitch. You would naturally sing out certain phrases to your copyist as you are composing, yes? To gauge the melodic flow?" This was a trap. Composers did not sing to their copyists. They wrote. To admit to dictating the music would suggest a lack of compositional fluency, or worse, illiteracy in music notation. "My sister," Elias stated firmly, "is simply extremely quick at transcribing my notes. I write the score, she merely tidies the parts." "A shame," Malos sighed dramatically. "I was hoping she could give us her opinion on Herr Edelweiss's use of the Neapolitan sixth chord in his last symphony. It was an unusual, almost radical choice for the time." The Neapolitan sixth, Alara's personal favorite, placed in the symphony in D minor's development section, a deep, surprising harmony intended to evoke a moment of intense yearning. Elias was staring blankly. He had forgotten the detail, or perhaps never understood its significance. Alara's pulse hammered in her ears. She knew she shouldn't speak. She knew she had to remain the mute shadow. But the insult to her music, the implication that Elias couldn't defend his own artistic choices, was too much. "It was not radical, Count," Alara heard herself say, her voice barely above a whisper, but shockingly clear in the silent room. Elias froze. Kreutzer slowly turned his head. Malos's smile widened, triumphant. Alara instantly regretted the words. She had broken the rule. "It was not radical," Alara repeated, her mind scrambling for a plausible, copyist-level explanation. "It was necessary. It prepares the ear for the return to the home key with maximum emotional tension. It is the perfect harmonic vehicle for that theme." A heavy silence descended. Kreutzer looked at Alara with a profound, sudden interest. Malos simply watched her, his eyes gleaming with unsettling comprehension. Elias put a clammy hand on Alara's shoulder. "My sister merely repeats what she has heard me say, gentlemen. She has a fine memory for my notes." Malos lifted his glass of wine, his gaze never leaving Alara's face. "Indeed, a very fine memory. Do tell me, Fräulein," he continued, using the formal address, "when Herr Edelweiss composes, does he lock you in the room with him, or do you require him to work in absolute solitude?" The implication was clear. Which one of you is truly holding the quill? Alara forced herself to meet his eyes, her heart beating a frantic prestissimo rhythm.
Following the nerve-wracking meeting, Ilara retreated into a desperate kind of artistic fury. Count Melis's gaze had burned away any remaining innocence about the arrangement. This wasn't just a family secret anymore. It was a high-stakes gamble against powerful, suspicious men. If she failed to deliver the concerto, Elias would be ruined, taking their family name and future with him. If she succeeded, she risked fueling Melis's suspicions until he found a way to expose her. Ilara worked through the nights. The darkness was her accomplice. By day, she had to maintain her role as the quiet copyist, sometimes sitting for hours while Elias feigned work in the study, dramatically scratching out bad ideas onto parchment he knew she would discard. But in the velvety blackness, Ilara was Elias von Edelweiss. She was free. She began the first movement, Allegro con fuego. It had to be relentless, a fiery declaration. She translated the anxiety and frustration from the meeting with Kreutzer into a demanding, jagged violin line. She tackled the complex double-stop passage, weaving the diatonic tension build Elias had promised, culminating in that sudden, gut-wrenching harmonic pivot into the dominant minor. Her fingers flew across the parchment. She wasn't just writing notes, she was mapping her own heartbreak onto the musical staff. The ink was barely dry on the Allegro when she started the second movement, Adagio semplice. This was Ilara's true voice, a slow, heartbreaking melody for the solo violin, intimate and profound. It was a lament for the life she couldn't live, a conversation with the world she wasn't allowed to address. She wrote it with particular care, pouring into the melody an aching tenderness and complexity that she knew Elias could never convincingly claim. The temptation of a signature. One chilly afternoon, Elias burst into her room, his face flushed. "Ilara, Kreutzer has sent word. He is demanding a sample, the first 20 pages of the score, now. He wants to review the technicality of the opening statements before he commits the funds for the full orchestra rehearsal." Panic seized Ilara. She had the first movement written, but it was in her rapid, messy composer's hand, riddled with crossed-out measures and sudden additions. "It is not clean, Elias. I haven't even started to ink the parts. I was waiting to finalize the dynamics." "There is no time for that," he hissed, sweeping her working drafts onto the floor. "Just write out the first 5 pages, the opening motif and the first solo statement. Write it beautifully, as if you were preparing it for the Emperor. Hurry!" Ilara snatched a fresh sheet of parchment. She dipped her finest quill and began to transcribe the notes quickly and elegantly. Her hand moved with practiced grace, shaping the notes into neat black jewels on the page. As she reached the end of the 5th page, she paused. She was transcribing the final measure, a quiet, sustained chord in the low strings, meant to lead into the first brilliant flourish of the solo violin. An impulse, sharp and shocking, shot through her, a sudden, defiant need to leave a mark that was truly hers, a single, small, intimate rebellion. She could not sign her name, but she could leave a trace in the music itself. In the 18th century, composers often used cryptic numerical codes or tiny melodic patterns to represent initials or names. Ilara's full name was A.V.E., Ilara von Edelweiss. She knew of a famous composer who used the notes B-A-C-H. She would use her own musical signature, one that only a deeply experienced musical scholar, someone like Kreutzer or perhaps Malus, might possibly recognize. She quickly altered the sustained chord and the low strings. Instead of a simple triad, she added a tiny, almost subliminal countermelody into the cello line, a four-note motif. E, E flat, L, A natural, using the German notation for A flat, altering the harmony slightly, R, D natural, using the German notation for D. The notes E flat, A flat, D slid silently into the cello part, a ghostly, beautiful signature hidden deep within the harmony, so subtle it would likely pass unnoticed by anyone but the keenest eye studying the score. It added an unexpected depth and sweetness to the chord, a slight moment of hesitation before the fireworks began. It was the first time Ilara had intentionally placed something in a score that was purely hers, an act of musical defiance. The risk was terrifying. If anyone noticed, they might look closer, connecting the notes to her name. But the reward, the silent, thrilling knowledge that she had signed her soul onto the score, was intoxicating. The exchange. Elias snatched the pages before the ink was fully dry. "Perfect! You are a miracle, Ilara!" he breathed, his anxiety replaced by relief. He rushed out the door to deliver the sample. Ilara sank onto her stool, staring at the empty space where the score had been. Had she made a mistake? Was that subtle melodic change too conspicuous? Later that evening, Elias returned, strangely subdued but victorious. "It is done," he announced, closing the door quietly. "Kreutzer has accepted the sample. He called the opening movement daring. He has released the funds for the first rehearsal in 4 weeks." "And Malus?" Ilara asked, the question heavy with dread. Elias hesitated. "Malus was there. He merely watched. But Kreutzer had something to say about the final chord of the 5th page." Ilara's heart seized. The signature. Kreutzer paused, Elias continued, running a nervous hand through his hair. He pointed directly to that quiet cello line. He said it was a remarkable moment of vulnerability, an unexpected and profoundly human touch in an otherwise explosive opening. He asked me how I conceived of that specific harmonic change. Elias shook his head, looking utterly bewildered. I told him it came to me in a dream. What else could I say, Ilara? What was that note for? It was not in the working draft. Ilara felt a strange mix of terror and elation. Her musical signature had been detected, not as a name, but as a moment of profound genius. Kreutzer had loved her secret message. But the danger was still there. Malus, the quiet observer, was watching, and he knew Elias was a liar. "It was an improvement," Ilara said, her voice shaking slightly. "It must stay." The deadline was now 4 weeks away. The concerto was half finished, and the scrutiny from Vienna's elite had just intensified. Ilara knew that Malus would now be waiting, looking for the next inevitable crack in Elias's flawless facade.
4 weeks later, the air in the rehearsal hall of the Vienna Court Opera was thick with dust, rosin, and anticipation. This was not the gilded concert hall, but the working space, raw, cold, and brutally honest. The orchestra, a collection of some of Vienna's finest musicians, was gathered. Kapellmeister Kreutzer sat in the first row, his arms crossed, demanding perfection. Count Malus stood by a shadowy pillar, an impassive spectator whose silence felt louder than the entire orchestra. Ilara was positioned as close to Elias as possible without being noticed, tucked behind the harpsichord, ostensibly tuning it, but in reality she was the conductor's anchor. Elias was sweating despite the chill.
The full weight of the score, the violin concerto in G major, was in his hands, and he barely understood the complex architecture of its movements. "Gentlemen," Kreutzer announced, his voice echoing in the hall, "we begin with the Allegro con fuego. Herr Edelweiss, your downbeat, if you please." Elias raised his baton. The orchestra plunged into the fiery opening motif. The music was overwhelming. Ilara, listening from the shadows, felt a profound, bittersweet joy. To hear her notes, not in her head, but in the vibrant, thundering reality of a full orchestra, was an almost unbearable validation of her existence. The music was a living, breathing creature. The first challenge came almost immediately, the crucial harmonic pivot leading into the solo violin's entrance. The cellos and basses played the low, sustained chord, the chord containing Ilara's silent coded signature, E flat to A flat to D. The sound was magnificent, the shift unexpected, just as she had intended. But Elias missed the delicate timing. He held the downbeat too long, disrupting the flow, making the transition sound clumsy and disjointed. The music ground to a halt. Kreutzer slammed his hand on the arm of his chair. "Nein, Herr Edelweiss, what was that? The rhythm is broken. The tension you built was released too slowly. It sounded like the musicians were waiting for a lazy ship to dock. This is an Allegro con fuego, not a funeral march." Elias turned, his face white with humiliation. "My apologies, Kapellmeister. A moment of distraction. I will—" "A distraction?" Kreutzer scoffed. "This is the fulcrum of the entire first movement. It requires precise control, Herr Edelweiss. Why did you hold the beat?" Elias was speechless. He didn't know why the music demanded a sudden, whip-quick snap of the wrist. He only knew he had missed it. From behind the harpsichord, Ilara's mind raced. She needed to correct him without uttering a sound. She carefully reached into the small pocket of her apron and pulled out a clean handkerchief. With a quick, subtle motion, she flicked it open, letting the white cloth fall onto the black wood of the harpsichord keys. White for speed, black for delay. Elias, desperate, caught the flash of white. He inhaled deeply, understanding the signal. Faster, sharper. "My mistake, Kapellmeister. I believe I was overemphasizing the transition. We will take it again, and I assure you the tempo will be exact." Kreutzer grunted, skeptical. "See that it is." Elias took the cue again. This time, as the cellos hit the harmonic pivot, Elias's hand moved with the sudden, sharp command of a true conductor. The transition was flawless, electrifying. The solo violin entered like a streak of lightning. The glare of Malus up close. The rehearsal continued, but Malus was no longer leaning against the pillar. He had moved, slowly and deliberately, until he was standing directly behind the harpsichord, looming over Ilana. He watched Ilara as she silently corrected a forgotten marking in a violin part, her movements efficient and practiced. When the orchestra took a brief pause, Malus leaned down, his voice a low, cold vibration that only Ilara could hear. "Tell me, Fraulein," he murmured, addressing her not as a copyist, but as an equal in intellect. "That transition you just perfected for your brother, did it not require an almost telepathic connection with the score, an innate understanding of the composer's intent?" Ilara kept her head bowed, pretending to adjust the harpsichord's music rack. "My brother has been rehearsing with me daily, Count. I understand his intent." "Do you?" Malus challenged, his tone dangerously light, because Herr Edelweiss himself could not explain the simple timing. You, however, knew precisely when to crack the whip. Tell me, Fraulein Ilara, how did you determine that the tempo must be sharper at that moment? Ilara's mind raced for a safe, technical explanation. She couldn't use their handkerchief code to prove. "The chord," Ilara whispered, pointing a gloved finger to the cello line on the score, right over her secret signature. "It contains a moment of intense suspension leading into the resolution. If the suspension is prolonged even by a fraction, the tension dissipates. It must be driven forward to retain the harmonic energy." It was the perfect professional explanation, too perfect. Malos let out a soft, dry laugh. "A magnificent observation, Fraulein Ilara. That sounds exactly like a composer's defense of his own work, does it not? You have spent too much time reading music, perhaps, and not enough time dusting." He straightened up, fixing her with a knowing, unsettling look. "I find," he continued, loud enough for Elias to overhear from the podium, "that genuine genius leaves a residue, Herr Edelweiss. It clings to the walls, to the furniture, and occasionally to the quiet shadows who believe they are unseen." He paused, letting his gaze sweep from Elias to Ilara and back again. "I am eager to see how the rest of this concerto fares, Elias. If the second movement, the Adagio Semplice, is as profound as your opening, you will be the toast of Vienna. But if it falters, if the inspiration runs dry, then we shall know exactly where the true genius has departed." Malos delivered the final line like a chilling prophecy. He knew exactly what to watch for. The slow movement, Ilara's voice, her vulnerable, true signature. Ilara knew he was right. The Adagio was where the true risk lay, the place where she had poured out her heart. If Elias failed to capture its intimate, soulful character, the deception would collapse. The rehearsal of truth. 3 days after the tense initial run-through, the orchestra gathered again to rehearse the second movement, Adagio Semplice. The atmosphere was dramatically different. The fiery agitation of the allegro had been replaced by a heavy, profound stillness. The Adagio was a masterpiece of restraint. It opened with a sparse, almost bare texture, just the solo violin and a quiet, sustained accompaniment from the strings. It was the sound of profound, isolated grief, a voice speaking from the depths of a forced silence. Elias raised his baton. The soloist began to play. The music flowed fragile and heartbreakingly beautiful. It was Ilara's soul laid bare, a melody that begged to be understood. Elias was struggling. He was a conductor, yes, but he was not an actor. He could manage the mechanics of the allegro, but he could not convey the intimate, sorrowful, emotional content of the Adagio. His conducting was stiff, functional, and devoid of feeling. The tempo was technically correct, but the spirit was dead. Kreutzer, watching from his seat, scowled. "It is flat, Herr Edelweiss. It is like hearing a great poem read by a customs clerk. Where is the dolore? Where is the anguish? You wrote this music. Do you not feel it?" Elias gripped the baton until his knuckles were white. I do, Kapellmeister. Perhaps the soloist needs more guidance on the rubato." "The soloist is brilliant," Kreutzer roared. "He plays what you give him. You are giving him a ledger book, not a soul. If you cannot convey the emotion of your own work, how can we expect the orchestra to?" Ilara felt her heart clench. This was it. This was the moment the lie would fail. The Adagio was failing because Elias could not connect with the very emotions Ilara had poured into the score. Malus, still leaning in the shadows, watched Ilara, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. He was waiting for Ilara to intervene. The silent instruction. Ilara knew a silent gesture was impossible this time. This was not about tempo. It was about feeling. Elias needed to understand the story behind the music. Desperate, Ilara stepped out from behind the harpsichord. The eyes of Kreutzer and Malus snapped to her. She walked slowly toward the music stand, ostensibly to adjust a page that wasn't moving. As she passed Elias, she paused, her eyes locked onto a single point on the music stand, a measure halfway through the movement, where the solo violin melody climbed to its heartbreaking apex before retreating. She knew this passage by heart. It was written in the key of E minor, a deeply melancholy choice, and the melody mirrored the shape of her own handwriting when she was at her most despairing. Instead of speaking, Ilara took a small folded piece of paper from her pocket. It was not a musical instruction. It was a slip of paper with a single word written in her hand, in their private code. She pressed it briefly into Elias's palm, unseen by Kreutzer. Elias looked down at his hand, then discreetly opened the note. The word was Mother. That single word was the key. Ilara had written the adagio in the weeks following the anniversary of their mother's death, a death the family had never fully recovered from, and a grief Elias still carried like a stone. The adagio was not just sorrow, it was a private, shared lament. The unveiling of emotion. Elias crumpled the paper in his hand. The shock on his face was immediate and profound. He finally understood. This wasn't some abstract piece of music he was conducting. It was a deeply personal, codified memorial. He looked at the solo violin, no longer seeing a series of notes, but seeing their mother's quiet, enduring pain. When he raised the baton again, his entire posture had shifted. The stiffness was gone, replaced by a conductor's vulnerability. He conducted with his whole body, his movements now fluid, sweeping, and agonizingly slow. He guided the soloist not with cold timing, but with gestures that mirrored a silent cry. He forced the cellos to hold the harmony just long enough for the sound to vibrate with a palpable sorrow. The difference was astonishing. The musicians, sensing the genuine emotion from the podium, responded instantly. The melody became imbued with a fragile, beautiful despair. It swelled, peaked, and then faded, leaving a silence that felt heavier and more complete than any music. Kreutzer sat motionless, tears welling in his eyes. God in heaven, Herr Edelweiss, that was truth itself. That is the work of a man who knows profound grief. Elias was breathing heavily, his eyes still distant, lost in the memory the music had evoked. He had finally found his connection to Ilara's art. The fatal recognition. Count Malus, however, was not weeping. He walked slowly out of the shadows and stopped directly in front of Ilara, his smile now chillingly complete. "Indeed, Kapellmeister," Malus said, his voice ringing with false admiration. "The composer clearly knows profound grief." He looked directly at Ilara, whose face was pale and whose eyes were red-rimmed from the emotion of hearing her own secret expressed so perfectly. "And it seems, Herr Edelweiss," Malus continued, turning to Elias, "that your dedicated little copyist, Fraulein Ilara, is so attuned to your genius that she too feels the profound emotion of your work." He paused, then delivered the final, crushing blow. "Tell me, Ilara," Malus asked, using her first name with unnerving intimacy, "when you wrote out the final draft of this score, did you notice the particular shape of the solo violin line at the climax? It shares the exact same unique flowing character as your handwriting on the Adagio's title page." Ilara stared at him, her heart sinking. She had been so focused on the hidden musical codes that she had forgotten her most obvious signature, her own script. "You have a unique flourish on the stem of the high F sharp, a beautiful feminine curl, and I noticed the same unique flourish on your signature in the palace registry when you arrived. Do not misunderstand, Elias. The music is brilliant, but I think perhaps we are applauding the wrong genius." He had them. The secret was exposed. Ilara had given away her identity not with a note, but with the subtle curve of a quill stroke. A terrible silence fell over the rehearsal hall. Kapellmeister Kreutzer looked from Malus to Elias and finally to the trembling Ilara, his confusion hardening into realization. Elias's face was a mask of utter devastation. He knew he was caught. "Count Malus," Elias choked out, attempting a final desperate defense. "You exaggerate a coincidence. My sister is my copyist. She—" "Enough, Elias." Malus cut him off, his voice carrying the authority of a judge. He turned to Kreutzer. "Kapellmeister, the work is sublime, but the artist is deceptive. What say you? Do we tolerate such deceit in the Vienna court opera?" Kreutzer, though stern, looked intensely conflicted. He had just been moved to tears by the Adagio. He looked at the sheet music, then back to Ilara, recognizing the profound genius that had just been hidden in plain sight. "The deception is regrettable, but the music is extraordinary. It is the finest concerto I have encountered in a decade." He pointed a finger at Elias. "You, Herr Edelweiss, are a fraud. You have stolen your sister's birthright and tried to pass it off as your own." He then looked at Ilara, his expression softening slightly. "And you, Fraulein Ilara, have committed a far greater sin. You have robbed the world of your genius. Why?" Ilara finally lifted her chin, meeting the gaze of the three powerful men. The fear was still there, but it was now eclipsed by a cold, righteous anger. "Because," Ilara stated, her voice clear and ringing, "a woman's name on that score would have guaranteed its immediate rejection. You would have praised its delicate charm and dismissed its complexity. You required a man to deliver the genius, so a man I provided." Malus smiled, recognizing the truth and the boldness of her answer. "A bold move, Ilara. But now the truth is known. What happens next? We can silence this, or we can ruin Elias and the name Edelweiss forever." He offered a solution, a poisonous compromise. "I can ensure the concerto is performed as scheduled under Elias's name. We keep your secret, and the family is saved. But you must compose only for me, and only under absolute secrecy for the rest of your life." Elias, weeping silently, nodded in agreement. "Take the deal, Ilara. Save us." The conductor's choice. Ilara looked at her brother, seeing not the arrogant fraud, but the weak man who had traded her sister's identity for survival. She then looked at the score, her violin concerto in G major, lying exposed on the stand. If she accepted Malus's deal, she would ensure the performance and the family's stability, but she would forever be confined to the shadow, her success dependent on the silence of a manipulative critic. Her music would be heard, but her soul would remain anonymous. She thought of the Adagio, the voice that finally spoke her truth. It was a voice she could no longer silence. Ilara walked to the podium, past her frozen brother. She picked up the score of the concerto. "I thank you for your generous offer, Count," Ilara said, her voice firm, surprising even herself. "But I will not trade my entire future for a 6-week performance contract, nor will I continue to feed my work to a parasite." She looked at Elias, whose eyes were wide open with panic. "The name A. von Edelweiss is tainted. It is a lie. If my music must be performed, it will be under an honest name." With deliberate, shocking slowness, Ilara tore the title page from the score, ripping the name Elias von Edelweiss right down the center. She held the torn paper up. "You are right, Count Malus. The world must not be robbed of this music, but it must be performed on honest terms." She looked directly at Kreutzer, the only man with the power to truly legitimize her work. "Kapellmeister Kreutzer, I will not beg for your patronage, but I offer you a challenge. Perform the concerto as scheduled. Do not announce the composer's name at all. Let the music speak entirely for itself. Let Vienna judge the work based solely on its merit, free from the prejudice of gender." Kreutzer stared at the woman before him. She was not begging. She was daring the entire Viennese establishment to acknowledge her talent. Malus let out a cynical laugh. "Impossible! They demand a name. They demand an identity." "Then let the name be anonymous. Let the performance be a testament to what genius can achieve when the artist vanishes and only the art remains."
Kapellmeister Kreutzer hesitated for a long, agonizing moment. To present a major modern work at the court opera without a named composer was unprecedented. It was a scandal waiting to happen. But the music was truly transcendent. Kreutzer looked at Malus's expectant face, at Elias's desperate pleading, and then back at Ilara, whose determination was a force field around her. He made his decision. "The challenge is accepted," Kreutzer announced, the words echoing through the silent hall. "The violin concerto in G major will be performed, but its composer shall be known only as the hand behind the curtain." Ilara felt a sudden, profound relief, a freedom she had never known. It was not her name, but it was not her brother's either. It was a truth. Elias was ruined, but the family would survive on the fees already paid. He would go on to live a quiet life haunted by the shadow of the genius he could never possess. On the night of the gala, the court opera was packed. The performance was a sensation. The allegro thrilled, and the adagio reduced the audience to hushed reverence. The critics raved. They argued endlessly about the identity of the anonymous composer, some claiming it was a secretly commissioned work by an aging master, others suggesting a brilliant new talent was hiding in the countryside. Ilara sat in the audience, next to her shamed, silent brother. She was still unseen, still Ilara von Edelweiss, the quiet sister. But as the thunderous applause shook the gilded chandeliers, and as her music soared into the heavens, she knew the truth. She closed her eyes, and for the first time she felt her invisibility fade. Her music was heard, her soul had spoken, and in the secret shared language of the score, the secret composer had finally claimed her crown. Vienna, 1 year later. The scandal surrounding the anonymous concerto had not faded, it had merely evolved into legend. The violin concerto in G major was the most performed work of the season, a musical puzzle that occupied every salon and coffee house. Count Malus, infuriated by his failure to control the outcome, published scathing articles demanding the composer be named, but the public adored the mystery. Ilara von Edelweiss still lived in the Edelweiss house, but her life was fundamentally changed.
Elias, stripped of his fraudulent fame, had quietly moved to the countryside to manage the small inherited estates, leaving Ilara in charge of the household and its meager finances. She was no longer just the copyist, she was the household's secret source of income. Under the guise of a highly skilled, anonymous musical transcriber, a new respectable profession that men would pay handsomely for, Ilara began to sell her services. She composed privately for wealthy patrons who wished to pass off technically difficult works as their own, or who needed an original piece for a specific occasion. She did not seek fame, she sought freedom. One brisk afternoon, Ilara sat at her desk, the window finally open, letting in the cool, crisp air. She was not working on a symphony, but on a commission for a set of 6 complex string quartets, chamber music, intimate and private, that she knew would travel through the homes of Europe's elite without demanding a public name. A carriage pulled up outside. It was Kapellmeister Kreutzer. He was old, stern, and carried a thick musical score tied with heavy ribbon. He was no longer there to reprimand a fraud, but to pay a call on a peer. "Fräulein Ilara," Kreutzer said, stepping into her dimly lit room, "I have not come to reveal your secret. I have come to commission a new one." He placed the score on her desk. It was an old, unfinished manuscript by a great master, abandoned 30 years prior. "The Emperor wishes this piece completed. He wishes the completion to be masterful, seamless, and utterly faithful to the original genius. It must be a perfect, quiet continuation of a legend." Kreutzer looked at her with profound respect. "There are only 2 hands in Vienna I trust to complete this task without defiling the original composer's soul. One of them is too old to hold a quill. The other—" He let the sentence hang, his gaze resting on her. Ilara understood. She was being offered the ultimate secret commission, to be the ghost composer for history itself. It was the highest possible compliment to her technical brilliance and her artistic integrity. "The payment will be substantial," added Kreutzer, his eyes twinkling, "and the anonymity will be absolute. It will simply be recorded as completed by a highly trusted member of the court's inner circle." Ilara picked up the ancient manuscript, feeling the weight of the legacy in her hands. She was not allowed to have her own name in history, but she could quietly shape history itself. She nodded, a small knowing smile touching her lips. "I accept, Kapellmeister Kreutzer. The hand behind the curtain is ready to begin work." Ilara von Edelweiss never saw her name in print on a major score, but over the next few decades, the musical world would marvel at the mysterious string of perfect, anonymous compositions that suddenly appeared, pieces that breathed the secret, sublime life into the strict world of Viennese classicism. She was not the composer of her era, she was the composer in her era, the secret, unheard genius whose silent contributions enriched the music of the world forever.
Florence, 1545. The air, usually fragrant with cypress and leather, was thick with nervous tension. The powerful Medici family had tightened their grip on the city, and while the streets were superficially orderly, whispers of dissent and secret allegiances curled like smoke around every corner. Niccolò Bellini was not a soldier or a diplomat. He was a scholar of exceptional intellect, specializing in cartography, geometry, and ancient texts. By day, he worked within the hallowed silence of the Laurentian Library, meticulously restoring antique maps. By night, however, Niccolò navigated a far more dangerous landscape, the intricate web of Florentine political espionage. He was the eyes and mind of a small, desperate circle of old Republican sympathizers, men and women who dreamed of Florence free from Medici rule. Niccolò's role was simple.
He was the Niccolò sat hunched over a heavy oak table in his small, discreet workshop, illuminated only by a single oil lamp. Before him lay a magnificent, newly acquired map of the city. At first glance, it was a work of art, commissioned by a wealthy wool merchant. The detail was exquisite, showing the course of the Arno River, the placement of the bridges, and the precise angles of the city's defense walls. But Niccolò had not spent his life studying spatial relationships for nothing. He noticed the minute, almost invisible flaws. The distance between the Ponte Vecchio and the Palazzo Pitti was slightly off. The ratio of the Duomo's dome height to its base diameter was mathematically incorrect. The errors were too perfect to be mistakes. They were deliberate. They were code. The map had been smuggled to him that morning by his courier, a young, anxious flower seller named Viola. Her instructions were simply, "The geometry is wrong. They sent this." Niccolò ran a trembling finger over a tiny misaligned fresco detail near the Piazza della Signoria. He knew the style immediately. It belonged to Maestro Emilio Falcone, a celebrated cartographer, architect, and, until a few weeks ago, a trusted advisor to the ruling Duke Cosimo I de' Medici. Maestro Falcone had suddenly vanished. The official story was that he'd gone to Rome on important business. The whispered truth was that he'd uncovered a conspiracy and paid the ultimate price for his loyalty. Niccolò pulled out his compass and ruler, the tools of his trade. He began to trace the geometrical errors across the map's surface, the cipher and the dagger. He started with the intentional flaws in the angles of the city's walls. He assigned a numerical value to the degree of error in each section, converting the spatial flaws into a sequence of numbers. He then used a pre-agreed-upon visionaire cipher hidden within the Latin dedications of an obscure text he'd memorized to translate the numbers. The result was a single, chilling phrase, "Porta sud aperta," South Gate open. This was a warning of an imminent attack, likely from the Duke's powerful rivals to the south, or perhaps even a planned entry point for Medici mercenaries disguised as foreign troops. But where was the who? Niccolò needed the identity of the betrayer, the person within the Medici inner circle who had orchestrated Falcone's disappearance and planned to open the city gates. He turned his attention to the most prominent feature, the River Arno. The river was depicted with subtle, intentional bends that did not align with its true course. Niccolò realized the misplaced bends were pointing directly at a sequence of specific buildings. He drew a straight line from the first three geometrically flawed buildings. The lines intersected at a fourth location, the Palazzo Guicciardini. This palazzo was the residence of Count Roberto Guicciardini, the Duke's formidable chief treasury minister. The Count was responsible for all military finances and, crucially, the oversight of the city garrisons. Count Roberto, Niccolò muttered, the name tasting like ash, treason cloaked in piety and gold. The discovery was explosive. If Niccolò's findings were correct, the Count was planning to betray the city, and the attack was scheduled to happen soon. He had to deliver this information to his Republican contacts. Niccolò quickly copied the key geometric analysis onto a small piece of parchment, noting the Porta Sud Aperta warning and the Guicciardini intersection point. He rolled the parchment and sealed it with a drop of crimson wax, stamping it with the nondescript seal of a local baker, a safe signal for his contacts. As he moved to extinguish the lamp, a shadow fell across the threshold of his workshop. A tall, formidable man stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was clad in dark, expensive velvet, a diamond glinting on his hand, and a thin, unsettling smile playing on his lips. This was Captain Matteo Salvi, the ruthless commander of the Medici secret police, the Duke's personal hound. "Niccolo Bellini," Captain Salvi said, his voice smooth and cold as polished marble. "A scholar of your talents should be asleep, preparing for the serious work of the day. Why are you burning the midnight oil over a decorative map?" Niccolo forced himself to remain calm, his hand subtly covering the tiny coded parchment. "Captain Salvi," Niccolo replied, rising slowly, "I was merely correcting a minor flaw in the scale used by Maestro Falcone. The curvature of the Arno is exaggerated, a small professional irritant." Salvi stepped closer, his gaze sweeping the room before fixing on Niccolo's desk. His eyes paused on the original map, then on the discarded scraps of paper covered in Niccolo's mathematical scribbles. "Ah, Falcone," Salvi murmured, his smile widening. "A pity about his sudden illness. But tell me, scholar, why did you just hide something in your coat?" Niccolo realized the fatal truth. Captain Salvi hadn't followed him. He had followed the map. He was hunting for whatever Falcone had hidden. The air snapped with danger. Niccolo had the evidence of treason hidden in his pocket, and the deadliest man in Florence was standing 3 feet away.
Niccolo's heart hammered against his ribs, but his scholar's training, the discipline required to maintain perfect stillness while calculating complex geometric proofs, saved him. His mind, accustomed to rapid calculation, worked furiously. He had 3 seconds before Captain Salvi moved. "A draft, Captain," Niccolo said, his voice level despite the tremor beneath. He pulled the wrong item from his coat pocket, not the sealed parchment with the code, but a folded, blank sheet he used for quick sketches. He presented it with a casual, almost irritated flick of the wrist. "A friend owes me a sum. I was checking the tally. Does the Duke's police now concern itself with a scholar's petty debts?" Captain Salvi took the blank paper, his eyes narrowing in cold contempt. He quickly unfolded it, saw the empty sheet, and scoffed. "You waste my time, Bellini. Your friend should pay you with less fanfare." Salvi threw the sheet back onto the desk, but the momentary distraction had given Niccolo the vital fraction of a second he needed. Salvi's attention immediately returned to the map on the table. "Let's return to Falcone's work," Salvi said, stepping closer. "You were correcting his flaws. Tell me, what great architectural error did you discover? Show me the calculations." Niccolo knew he couldn't reveal the true nature of his work. He grabbed the ink pot, a heavy, glazed ceramic piece, and, pretending to point to an area on the map, suddenly slammed the pot against the edge of the table. Black ink exploded across the desk, splattering the map, Niccolo's shirt, and, crucially, Captain Salvi's expensive silk doublet and the fine gold braiding on his sleeves. Chaos on the Arno. A gasp of pure rage escaped Salvi's lips. "You clumsy fool!" he roared, momentarily stunned and consumed by fury over the ruined clothing. This was Niccolo's chance. He vaulted the table, knocking over the oil lamp, plunging the small room into immediate blinding darkness, punctuated only by the angry sputtering of the oil. Niccolo was small but agile, honed by long hours spent climbing shelves in the Laurentian library. He darted toward the window, which overlooked a narrow, perpetually shadowed alley leading down to the Arno River. "Guards!" Salvi bellowed, scrambling over the fallen furniture. Niccolo opened the wooden shutters. The noise of Salvi's enraged footsteps was deafening behind him. He took a deep breath of the damp night air and threw himself out of the window, landing hard on the slick cobblestones below. He didn't wait. He ran, clutching the sealed coded message tight against his chest. He burst out of the alley onto the river path. Ahead, the Ponte Santa Trinita loomed, its stone arches black against the pale moonlight.